Hi, this is Karen Wickery, and welcome to a Google Author Talk, today featuring David Wolman. David is a journalist, a skier, a world traveler, a Fulbright Fellow. He's a contributing writer at Wired. He's been published in magazines like National Geographic Traveler, Discover, New Scientist, Outside. I think you are getting a picture already. His first book covered the broad meaning of left-handedness, which I'm sure will interest some of you after you've heard him on another topic. His most recent book he's talking about today is called Writing the Mother Tongue. It's an exploration of the trickery and confusion and infuriation of the English language and spelling in particular, history of English spelling. So please welcome David Wolman.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me. Let me get started by sharing with you a little bit of the genesis about this project and what exactly I was trying to do with the book all about spelling. And then after introducing you to some members of the Simplified Spelling Society, who are some rather radical language enthusiasts, by way of a reading, we can open things up for what I hope will be some lively questions and comments. So here we are. We have this terrible economic crisis. We have continuing struggles in Iraq, Afghanistan, collapsing healthcare system. Some people are out there thinking, spelling, a book all about spelling. How do you do that? It sounds like a frivolous distraction. But the truth is that the English spelling code, if you take it and put it under the microscope, you begin to see that the DNA of English orthography is about a lot more than just letters in a certain order. Encoded in the genome of English spelling, there are all of these really rich stories. Now, some of those stories probably are kind of trivial, archaic, if not outright bizarre. But there are other stories that I think are relevant and certainly hit on eternal themes. There are stories in here about war and individual passion and immigration. There are stories about education, stories about technology, of course, zooming from the printing press all the way up through spell check and texting. There are stories about the battle between authoritarianism and democracy, the very idea of right and wrong, and on and on. But perhaps most of all, the story of English spelling is really stories about change. And what I mean by that is, even though we think of spelling as this very straightforward thing, right? How do you spell a word? Well, you just look it up, and there's one, sometimes two right ways to spell things, and everything else is a wrong way to do it. But in fact, correct spelling was never handed down to us on stone tablets. It is a human innovation. And for that reason, not only has it been changing, but it's subject to all these forces that make it change. Forces like power and culture and taste and bias and accidental mutation. So one thing I wanted to do was try and follow the course of that change through history. In other words, how are all these words that we're using, how did they acquire their current form, and who are the agents of that change? And how will those words and their shapes change in the future, especially in the digital future? Now, English spelling, as most of you probably know, is no walk in the park. This is the result of a number of processes, but the big one is really that English is and always has been a mutt. From the very beginning, in the 5th, 6th centuries, you have these brave people crossing over from mainland Europe to this little island that we now identify as England. They settle these small villages, and they are already speaking a variety of Germanic dialects. These are the Angles and the Saxons and the Frisians and the Jutes. I love saying these names, by the way. I don't know why. And as soon as they get there, their languages are already cross-pollinating with the native Celtic, and pretty soon the languages of Scandinavia and France, and gradually Latin as well. And of course, this mutating process only accelerates through time. The English language just grows and grows as it vacuums up words from all over the world. On the ships of the British Empire, with the explosion of American English, And then, of course, with technologies, radio and film, and needless to say, the internet. So this process, this kind of snowballing effect and vacuuming up all these words, this is what makes English so magnificent and so powerful and so expressive. That's great for those of us who love words. The problem is, for those of us who are also poor spellers, this is the cause of a tremendous headache. Because when new words come into the lexicon, there are no customs agents at the border checking for identification and then trying to encode those words in a set system of English orthography that is consistent, phonetically consistent. So that when you compare English to German or Italian or Spanish or Finnish, a lot of these other languages with very regular orthography, English has a lot of words that are regular, but it also has this truckload of irregularly spelled words. For about 500 years or so now, there have been people who've been looking at this motley crew of English spelling, and they've said, this is a problem and we should do something about it. And their arguments were varied, but the ones that keep coming back year after year are the idea that non-native speakers are having too much trouble acquiring fluency, and that children are spending too much time in school memorizing correct spellings when they should be doing other things like learning math and science. One of my favorite arguments happens to be this idea that we're wasting too much money on copy editors, and if English was more predictable like German, then we could save a few bucks. So, as impractical, really, if not outlandish, as this idea might seem, rewriting the English spelling code so that it fits this much more predictable system, this campaign through the centuries has included the likes of some very important, intelligent, and really influential people, from Mark Twain to George Bernard Shaw, to, Ben Franklin, Melville Dewey, who gave us the Dewey Decimal System, Noah Webster of Webster's Dictionaries, President Teddy Roosevelt, Andrew Carnegie, the great philanthropist, and on this list goes. One of my favorites, really two favorites, Samuel Johnson, who gave us the first great dictionary. He was convinced that no English word should ever end with the letter C. So in his dictionary, critic and music and public, they all end with a K. Webster later did away with that. The other favorite has to be Dewey. Melville Dewey was so committed to the cause of spelling reform that at one point he changed the spelling of his last name to D-U-I. And this was before he was hired to be the librarian-in-chief at Columbia University, and his employers said, we're only going to hire you if you do away with that spelling silliness and get back to your D-E-W-E-Y. So another goal for me with this project was to synthesize the story of the spelling reform movement. I was seeing that it was being described in snippets here and there. In a biography of someone like Carnegie, it gets 2 pages. And in an 800-page book about the history of English, maybe it gets 4 or 5 pages. But I wanted to sort of look at the whole process from 30,000 feet up and understand these people and what they were trying to do, and why didn't they get further, and what were the circumstances for the few successes, particularly Noah Webster's success in changing the spelling of some words. So that was sort of goal number 2 with the book. So what I'd like to do this morning is introduce you to the modern-day torchbearers of the spelling reform movement. A couple of years ago, I learned about the Simplified Spelling Society, and as the name suggests, these are people who really believe that the world would be a better place if English spelling were simpler. So one of the ways they've been trying to gain publicity is every spring now, for the past couple of years, a handful of them fly to Washington, D.C. At the end of May. This is when the Scripps National Spelling Bee is taking place, and they stand out on the sidewalk with picket signs and wearing sandwich boards, trying to raise awareness for the cause. And the idea is this is such an opportune moment to do so because there's so many journalists covering the bee. And I can tell you from being there that after a little while, they get kind of tired and are really itching to cover something new or talk about spelling in a new way. And so the Simplified Spelling Society people, they're hoping to sort of capitalize on that attitude. So 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago now, I paid my $35 membership fee to join the Simplified Spelling Society, flew to Washington. I wanted to see what life is like from the inside of a protest of the English language in its current form. So the excerpt I'd like to share with you is from a chapter of the book called Spell Raisers. During our first morning stationed curbside outside the Grand Hyatt, Washington, things got off to a rough start. I watched one woman nearly accost a picketer named Elizabeth Kuizenga. With global warming, Iraq, so many other things going on in the world, you mean to tell me you're protesting spelling? Ridiculous. The woman was 5 paces away before Kuizenga could finish her polite reply about how this wasn't actually a protest of the bee, but a quote-unquote informational picket to improve literacy. After being snubbed, she looked at me excitedly and said, "Isn't this fun, being an underdog?" Kuizenga lives in the El Cerrito Hills, not far from Berkeley, California. Her protest sign pictured a bumblebee and the slogan, "Take the sting out of spelling." After more than 30 years of teaching English as a second language, the 59-year-old Kuizenga said she was so fed up with the litany of rule exceptions, homonyms, silent letters, and confusing vowel combinations within English orthography that she decided to do something about it. Even as a kid, she said, I thought the spelling system was ridiculous. My mind was just too logical to accept it. A few minutes later, a bald man wearing a yellow polo shirt paused before entering the hotel and turned to me and a society member named Peter Boardman. "Go to a library. It's free. If you can't learn to read in America, you can't learn anywhere." Another guy told us that spelling reform was the most absurd thing he had heard of since they tried to put clothes on horses. And a British television producer said, "Yeah, great idea. Let's just make spelling easy for the stupid people." Boardman hails from Goten, New York, not far from Ithaca. His car has an Ithaca Hemp Company sticker in the window. He has pale green eyes, a white goatee, and only a few wisps of hair beneath a Panama Jack hat. The last few years, Boardman was forced to miss the DC gathering because of chemotherapy. They poisoned me. I was in no condition to object. But this year, nothing was going to keep him from joining his fellow society members. Hoisting his picket sign, "Let's end the I in friend," he said he put off learning the results of his most recent round of blood tests until after his return. He didn't want the distraction. While raising 9 children and working in special education, Boardman began thinking about spelling reform. He hated all the booby traps of English orthography and felt they needlessly made life hard for children. The place he went looking for more information was the internet, where he quickly bumped into the Simplified Spelling Society. At first, I thought they were dingbats, which they are, but now they're my people. Another member of our platoon was Niall Waldman. Originally from Glasgow, Scotland, Waldman now lives in Ontario, Canada. "Spelling is the bullet hole and illiteracy is the exit wound," he told me. Waldman's picket sign featured a headshot of Ronald Reagan and the words, "Sensible spelling, good enough for him, good enough for us." That's ENUF. Reagan had used abbreviated spellings from time to time. Early in the afternoon, a man wearing a stars and striped patterned necktie spotted Waldman's sign and did a double take. Halting his charge down the sidewalk, he gestured to the portrait of the former president and barked at Waldman. "That's insulting. He was a great man." I had expected some bewildered and unfriendly reactions from the DC commuter set marching past the hotel, but the truly irate responses were from bee parents. "We have kids in this event, and this is insulting to them and what they've achieved," one mother yelled at Boardman. I can see her point. We were stationed directly outside the building where these families were having one of their most exciting and memorable weekends ever. The Simplified Spelling Society members kept insisting that this was not a protest, that they're fans of the bee, and that they think the young spelling stars are wonderful. But this attempt at diplomacy fell on deaf ears. Carrying signs with half-cheeky, half-argumentative slogans, we looked like Scrooges, raining on a beloved American parade and poo-pooing the achievements of talented children. Not exactly a stellar PR strategy. As for the kids, only a few displayed the kind of outward disdain that many adults did. Most just looked at us like we were zoo animals. A few came up to ask for buttons, pamphlets, and sometimes to pose for a photograph. One father let his son take a picture, but when Waldman tried to give the boy a button, the father intervened, forbidding the exchange as if Waldman were handing out flyers for a religious cult. Yet somehow, the accumulating criticism and ridicule fueled my comrades' resolve. Alan Campbell, a quiet 77-year-old man who came all the way from New Zealand, looked undeterred by the heat, from passerby or the nearly 100-degree weather. If we want to get the message out to the world, this is where we need to be. Despite his suppressed immune system, Boardman was similarly impervious. When one man zipped past the two of us without so much as a no-thank-you wave of the hand, and then another guy told us we were promoting, quote, stupidity and ghetto talk, Boardman chuckled. You'd think his face would splinter if he smiled. The thing is, some people are just so traumatized by the experience of learning to spell that they react violently. Call it PTSD, post-traumatic spelling disorder. Masha Bell is a spelling reformer from Dorset, England, who used to be a school teacher. It's so hard to get the media to take this seriously, she said. It's not like it was for people in the first part of the 20th century. Bell spent her childhood in Lithuania, though you'd never know it from her crisp British accent. She's 62 years old, marathoner fit, and, until you get her talking about language, of genteel disposition. I'm angry. It's just so stupid. That's something, of course, I'm angry. It's just so stupid, she told me. We waste so much of kids' lives on something so stupid. That something, of course, is English spelling in its current form. Bell and her society fellows are certain that a better understanding of the twisted history of English orthography and of the difficulties children face in school as a result of it will hasten the realization that change is overdue. If they'd left Chaucer's system intact, English spelling wouldn't be in the mess it's in today, said Bell. Chaucer's spelling, or more likely the spelling of his scribes, was in fact quite variable. But Bell's more general message is valid. History has wreaked havoc on what used to be a more standard phonetic orthography. I asked Bell if she ever thought about abandoning the cause, given the long odds, and that people tend to read and write with the language they have, not the language they wish they had. Not at all, she said. It's so defeatist to accept what you've got. Never mind about improving things, it's ridiculous to think that way. We'd still have slavery, and women still wouldn't be allowed to vote. The history of progress, Bell continued, is largely made up of episodes in which people have, quote, tried to improve the lot of the majority. Spelling reform is really no different. When she said this, I thought back to the oft-quoted Oxford professor, Max Mueller, who told an audience in 1901 that practical spelling reformers, quote, should never slumber nor sleep. They should repeat the same thing over and over again, undismayed by indifference, ridicule, contempt, and all the other weapons which the lazy world knows so well how to employ against those who venture to disturb the peace. Thank you. So, questions, comments, spelling bee, horror stories, anything, please share.
So you explained a little bit where the content of the book came from, but where did your interest in the topic come from?
First, it was learning about the Simplified Spelling Society. And initially, I thought this was definitely a great magazine story idea. I mean, if you love nonfiction, you love to write about people with unusual passions or little subcultures. And, they've got that written straight across their forehead. But then the idea was, well, how to expand that into a larger book? And I'm not a good speller, so I sort of have a horse in this race, a little bit. I mean, I should say right off the bat, I'm not a spelling anarchist. I have fairly conservative tastes about language. But as I thought more about the Simplified Spelling Society people and then did a little bit more reading, these experiences from my childhood started to come back. And again, this is not like spelling memoir or woe is me, but this was troublesome. My younger brother, he's 4 years younger, and he was sort of a spelling whiz, and it was cause for a certain amount of humiliation at the dinner table. And as I started to look back on this now from sort of the journalism perspective, I started to think, well, maybe there's a book here. Of course, this is a book about words, but it's also about people and their attitudes toward words. Why do we have this idea that accurate spelling is equal to virtuous behavior? Because it's just this sort of learned, memorized thing. And so those were some of the questions I wanted to needle at. I wouldn't say answer, but start asking. And then I started to think, okay, well, maybe there's a book here. Maybe I can do kind of some travelogue in the front part, following the course of that language change through history, and then later I can look at things like dyslexia and the impact of the internet and Google on language. And an editor agreed that could be a fun idea. Yes?
I've read that English doesn't have a formal academy like French, for instance, and that's often why there's such variance in the words. And I'm wondering if you found what's changed in maybe like the past 10 years with spelling.
Well, so there are probably somewhere between 17 and 50,000 reasons why formal spelling reform won't happen for English. But one of the big ones is the absence of a language academy. English has always resisted this trend, but that's not for lack of trying. And there's a chapter in here devoted to that idea. It's called Valiant Exterminators of Dialectical Vermin. And these are the people like Jonathan Swift and John Donne and Dryden. They believed that English, the same old argument, English is drifting too much. It's drifting too much from the language of Shakespeare or from Chaucer, and we need to anchor it somewhere. And the only way to do that is to have a big group of white educated men sitting around a table in London or Oxford deciding on the way it should be for the rest of us. And luckily, English always resisted that. In the last 10 years, what's happening? It's interesting, this talk I'm giving tomorrow is to a group of editors, and a lot of them, I'm sure, have these much more sort of persnickety tastes about punctuation and language and things. And the reality is that language is always moving and always changing. And is it can I have an ice cream or may I have an ice cream? Or is it invited Michelle and I to the White House or invited Michelle and me to the White House? This is what Barack Obama said recently. President Bush invited Michelle and I to the White House, and people were upset about that. And so, the good news is that English is doing what it's always doing, but and I'd love to hear from some of you if you agree, but in the digital age, it looks like some of that language change, especially with spelling, is just happening faster. Because in the age of dictionaries, you have lexicographers and dictionary editors, combing heavily edited printed prose for the newest words and the right spellings that writers and editors are putting out there to the world. But now, we are all, in a way, participating in English's evolution. And I don't know where the numbers are on these kind of things, and it's too early to know if a text message code like BTW will have staying power 10 or 15 or 30 years from now if the input devices change a lot. But there's no question that just because of the rate of communication and content online, that some of this change is just happening faster. And to those of us who just love words and love language, period, and aren't really that scared of language evolution, it's such a pleasure to watch this stuff live. There was a woman at one of my readings who was like 14 or 15, And she shared with us that, and some of you might know this, that CULE is a text code alternative spelling for cool. I didn't understand this at all, and certainly other members of the audience didn't either. And she said, because it's just as long, it's 4 letters, it's 4 letters. Where's the energy efficiency in that? And she said because of the input device, it's a lot easier to do the CULE than COOL. Is that permanent? Who knows? And for that matter, what is permanent? But those are the kind of things that I think are exciting to watch right now.
Hi. Thank you for coming. I was wondering if you were talking about the Simplified Spelling Society, and I was wondering if they had decided upon, a pattern and rules and what they thought the best way of spelling would be, and then further if they had some sort of translated books or translated websites or if they had made any movements in that
Right.
direction.
What are they doing?
Yeah, to promote this, yeah.
So the short answer is no. They don't have an agreed upon way to fix the code. And it's probably one of the weak points in their operation is the lack of a unified mission. But what's entertaining about them is, they all are pursuing varied schemes. And so during my weekend with them, at different times, they would pull me away, as their chronicler. Someone would pull me to the side and say, Dave, these bozos don't know what they're doing, but this is the real code. And then someone else would say, you really need to follow the sure, simple spelling system, blah, blah, blah. Here's the website. And okay, I'll check it out. And, they're all convinced that the ideas in their mind for the changes are the right ones. But, while we were there, the big discussion in the hotel room before the protest is, do we use simplified spellings on our picket signs? And the answer is no, because we can't agree on which ones to do. We want to make sure people can read the signs. So there's, they've got some work to do. And, again, we could talk about some other reasons why they have a long road ahead. Accent and dialect is another one. If you're going to rewrite the English spelling code because I say Boston and you say Boston, or tomato, et cetera, whose pronunciation do we base a phonetic code on? Are we going to redo the entire alphabet? Spoken English has about 44 distinct sounds. We have an alphabet with 26 letters, so already you're in trouble, even if you do some cool combining like CH. And so these are some of the struggles they have. And I don't want to sound too, overly harsh, really, because there's something really endearing about these people generally, about subcultures like that. I think their motivation is earnest. They're really nice people to spend time with, and it didn't bother me that they embraced something that the rest of us find so impractical.
So I'm in my 30s, and I've seen grammar change substantially in the time from when I learned how to read till now, but I can't really think of too many instances where spelling, at least the spelling that's accepted by, what the New York Times would consider the proper spelling, I haven't seen that change substantially. Can you give me some counterexamples of where that's true?
Yeah, well, what happens is the rate of change is different. And so you're absolutely right. Like compared to neologisms, new words are always being added to the lexicon. We can see the evolution of language because pre-boarding and ixnay and cyber terrorism and kiteboarding were just added into the Oxford English Dictionary a year or two ago, right? So those are the ways that we can more easily see language evolution. Problem is with spelling is that as English was evolving, spelling kind of settled, especially once we get printing in the scene. But meanwhile, pronunciation is moving ahead much faster. And so that's why we have things like night and knife with a K, whereas however many hundred years ago, they were pronouncing that as knickta, kniff or knife or something like that. And so you're right in the sense that spelling looks more locked in place. But what would be a couple of examples? I think in the 17th century or so, people were saying they wanted English to look more Latin or more Greek. They thought it would give it sort of pomp and circumstance. And so even though they were spelling words like det, D-E-T, or D-E-T-T-E, some people said, well, let's put a B in there to make it look like debitum, the Latin for the same word. And so you literally had people tinkering with the spelling code. And then today, you're seeing it with mostly online. Examples that I'm having a little trouble thinking right now, but there are definitely like different ideas. Is THRU for through? Is a good example for me, because you're still not going to see that in the New York Times or in a book. And yet, how wrong is that really? Because we're all using it, sometimes on formal documents, sometimes only in email. And a favorite example really that I learned here from Peter and Noah at Google is a word like Dalmatian. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's also one of my favorite components of this project is this idea that if so many people are spelling Dalmatian, the place, or spotted dogs, as Tion instead of Tian, which is the quote-unquote correct version, when people search for that in Google search, they don't get a suggested spelling correction because Google search knows what you're looking for, and enough people out there are spelling Dalmatian that way that, who are, it's interesting, usually I say, who's Google to say, but in this case, it's who are all of you to say how the rest of us should be spelling. And so those are some of the changes that we're starting to see. Ask me after, and we'll talk about some more specific examples in our lifetime, because I'm in my 30s as well, so.
So it seems like Italian is an example of a language where they do have a more simplified spelling. There are no spelling bees there. You would never have gotten your book deal there. And yet, somehow, Italian students don't jump ahead by 3 years over their contemporaries in other countries. So what does that say? How were the Italian border guards able to keep out? They have close neighbors in France and Germany and so on. How do they keep them out? And does this say that the reformers are wrong, that it seems to not make that much difference?
I think the reformers are wrong, that English speakers are not losing out because they have to spend extra time in school learning this. People like Dewey and Carnegie, they really subscribe to this idea, really a number out of thin air, that American and British students were wasting 3 years of their education learning correct spellings. But in reality, when you kind of pit English-speaking students against Italian students or German students, on the one hand, Italian students might have fewer spelling errors, but it takes them longer to get through a passage or to write a passage, for example. And so there's kind of equalizing forces at play. And so, yeah, I think at the end of the day, the spelling reformers are wrong. This isn't crushing us and limiting our capacity to use our brains as much as we can, but for those teachers out there who do take it too seriously and are not going to let their students go do something else until they, until they spell miscellaneous or millennium properly, I'm not sure I buy that necessarily. Maybe you want to be promoting, a sentence that is meaningful, or a passage that is thoughtful, and not just hammering spelling training. And luckily, most people agree with that. It's not the 1950s anymore.
I guess just 2 comments on the last one. Chinese and Japanese is a much more complex reading and writing system, and almost in contrary, we see those cultures tend to excel in math and science. They're spending more time learning to read and write. Right. And yet it doesn't seem to it maybe is actually the reason why they excel in some of those other areas.
It's a really good point. I think the argument can be made for sort of exercising that area of the mind. What's maybe too bad is we are celebrating in this country spelling achievement. And don't get me wrong, I love the B. Now I sound like these people. I love the B. The kids are wonderful. it's for literacy. But I do see that, where is ESPN, to cover the math Olympiad kind of thing? It seems to be a disproportionate infatuation with spelling success, and what are these kids really good at? But, beyond that. And actually, the 2007 winner was this marvelous kid who not only was a spelling whiz, but also this music and math genius. And I'm sort of giving away the farm here, but the interviewer at the end asked him, we heard that you really like math and music more than spelling. Is that true? Is that still true now that you're holding the trophy? And the poor kid, he was really on the spot. He said, I know what you're trying to get me to say, but spelling is really just all this memorization. And then he began to talk about how the music and math, they just kind of light up his life, and the numbers fit together so beautifully. And music is this creative outlet, and spelling is just this sort of, I feel like a robot learning spelling. And it must have been tough on the other spellers who just lost.
And then I guess just one comment, a word, or at least a plural, that I think has been in my lifetime, and it's my favorite one, is the plural for index. It drives me crazy when computer scientists insist it's indices. And I love that indexes is now officially in the dictionary.
Exactly. And who decides? That was another one of the questions for this project, is trying to get to that idea of who decides, what makes it ultimately in the dictionary. And in the dictionary, that also is not handed down from on high. That's just a group of language lovers also who've seen indexes enough times in heavily edited prose or online in what they consider to be reputable sources that they say, hey, let's put it in. But what's even more exciting now is we have things like Wiktionary.org. So the masses are really sort of pulling the power away from the dictionary mavens. So you can see redunculous as an alternate spelling for ridiculous on Wiktionary.org. And some people, this just makes their skin crawl. And certain things make my skin crawl too. Irregardless is a tough one for me. Even between you and I think because my older sister was tough on me when I said that, when I hear people say between you and I, and technically it should be between you and me, those things make me bristle, and yet because I do a lot of science writing and because I talk to a lot of linguists for this project, I have a lot more respect now for this idea that, if the essential nugget of information is transmitted without any problem, what's the problem? Can I have an ice cream? May I have an ice cream? We get it. We also know the school teacher explanation that, well, of course you can have an ice cream, but may I have an ice cream? I get that too. But I also know that everyone out there is using can I have an ice cream, and that linguists prefer a sort of descriptivist take on things than the prescriptivist one.
So you came to Google for part of your book research, and you talked to the folks who do the Did You Mean
Yes.
feature that we have. Could you talk a little about what led you to that aspect of modern terminology and spelling,
Sure.
and what your impressions were of fitting that in?
Sure. Well, a few immediate impressions. Let's see. When I went to visit with the president and publisher of Webster's Dictionaries in Springfield, Mass., we were talking about sort of the impact of the internet on his job, and what does it mean to be someone who still publishes a bound dictionary. And then, I asked him, what about Google? Do you guys even matter now that there's Google, or something cheeky or obnoxious like that? And he said, you can't deny these kind of forces. It's like an asteroid coming into your solar system. He said something to that effect. But what was interesting to me is they still are kind of falling back on this idea of lexicographers and editors doing their best to get their arms around the language and put it down in a book or an online version of the book. And they'll be the first to tell you that they're not gods, that they can't do this. English is too vast to ever encapsulate 100%. But they're doing their best, and they're watching us use a word like Google as a verb for 2 or 3 years before they say, okay, yeah, let's put it in the dictionary. It looks like it's going to be around for a while. But then I started to learn a lot more about how everyday people out there are using Google search as a spell check, just because it's quick and easy. And that was really interesting to me because, as all of you know better than I do, that's not what it's designed for. It's not a dictionary. And you guys aren't out there, and Google isn't trying to tell us what English should look like or what English will be like. It's just trying to help you get to information as fast as possible. Hence, really my favorite example with the Dalmatians, Tion versus Tian. And so that was really illuminating for me, that people are getting on there to use it just to check a spelling really quickly. And I confess, I've certainly done it. And then going back to whatever word processing software they're using and writing in the correct spelling they've found. But what gets interesting is, and it's just a few micro examples, but if you magnify it over the lexicon, you can see something happening, because if you search for THRU for through, or INTELLIGENT T apostrophe L. I'm pretty sure. You can all go check this later and prove me wrong. But there, or even DEPT for department, or ATTN for attention. You know, you're going to see all of these things in a search and in search results, and you're not going to get a suggested spelling correction. You know, likewise, is it theater in American style, or is it theater RE in the British style, or is it traveler with one L or two L's, center REER, and on and on. And so it's a really imperfect tool to use as a dictionary, as a spelling corrector, and yet everyone's doing it. And for me, what's exciting about that is it brings us back to this kind of power to the people idea, because if Google search is just telling us what's out there on the internet, and if what's out there on the internet is a lot of THRU for through, then maybe that version of the spelling is going to usurp the longer one. And I kind of like that stuff. I like these ideas of a kind of populist approach to language evolution, and Google really illustrates that beautifully. I mean it. I'm not just ingratiating.
So I heard what you had to say about what you thought the views were of the spelling reformers and whether you thought that would work. There are separate groups of people who have the same goals to simplify the language, but their target is to do it through reducing the size of the vocabulary. That English is, I guess you didn't run into those people based on that reaction. With English's history, it gets lots and lots of nearly synonymous words from a lot of different sources. And some are like, well, you don't need all of them, or you don't need long words. You can put together short words, and that would be good for pretty much everybody except the specialists. And I was wondering, now that I know that you haven't run into those people,
what do I think of them?
Yeah.
Well, I'd have to disagree. I mean, instinctively, and it's not only because I love writing and love words, but and want to sound literary. But I think it happens to be true that having beautiful and gorgeous and pretty, et cetera, that are all kind of synonymous, actually having all of those variants makes English that much more powerful and expressive, and they're not the same in the sentences in which they're used. And so I think they're wrong. I mean, I think English is fantastic because it's so broad and always growing. You know, it's just always vacuuming up words from abroad and new words. And so I think as long as we know a bunch of them, that's probably good. What do you think?
I agree.
In English and similar languages, what you write isn't always what you say, which is one of the major reasons why spelling is such an issue. But there are several languages in which that is true. I mean, what you write is always what you say. Do any of the things that you observe in your book apply to those languages in a general way?
You know, I didn't look at other languages too much because I'm not a linguist, and because I was really trying to hone in on this idea of English spelling, which was hard enough because it was hard not to drift into a history of English more broadly. But you do run into these questions. You know, we always say wanna and gotta. But why is it only slang to write WANNA or GOTTA when everyone is talking that way? And so again, this is one of those variant spellings that you're starting to see it pop up, and it's not only in quotations in a dialogue in a fiction book. But with other languages, I'm not really sure. I think it's an interesting idea. You know, how much does English differ on paper, or should it differ on paper from spoken English?
So along those spelling lines, one of my pet peeves has always been substituting adjectives for adverbs. You know, I ran quick to the store, and people say this all the time. I even hear people say this at Google, and it's just the one thing that really drives me insane. So what's your take on that? Any comments? I'm just kind of curious, because
Right.
it's not totally popular I think in spoken English, but it is fairly common. And I've worked at companies where it's much more common than it is here at Google. So
Well, I really try to keep a foot in both camps because, and descriptivism versus prescriptivism, because I have those same reactions. I bristle as well when I hear some of this bumbling. But then I remember, especially after doing all this work, that having that sort of radar that detects the bumbling is really kind of this classist thing going on of kind of the haves judging the have-nots, or the educated judging the not educated, or wanting this sort of gotcha tool. My sister just browbeat me with the between you and I versus between you and me. And the reality, again, comes down to, is the information being conveyed smoothly, without interruption or without difficulty? And I ran quick. And if there are people who are going to be watching this and who are grammar lovers who are going to hate me for saying this kind of stuff, but I really don't think there's such a problem with it if that's the way that everyone is talking. I think, do you want to be someone who reflects the language of your time, or do you want to be someone who reflects the language of what strict school teachers and siblings told you decades ago? And another way to think about that is, how wrong are they really, and says who? It's interesting you said even here at Google. He says who? Yeah, thanks. So even here at Google, is the way you'd introduce that, as if this crowd necessarily should be better with grammar. And maybe the answer is they should, but maybe the people here are terrific at other things, and they are actually reflecting the language of their time. And I don't know. But again, certain things just make my skin crawl. I can't stand it sometimes. So I understand where you're coming from about that and other pet peeves.
Is there a 12-step program for this?
Maybe that'll be the sequel.
Hi. So you could make the argument that the simplified spelling movement strips, and I think you sort of hinted at this, strips the language of its history with words like enough. I mean, it seems like there must be some stories in there as to how that became the default spelling, and there's all kinds of totally bizarre spellings like that just kind of fairly scream out for some kind of interesting tale. So do you have any good examples?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. This would be one of the travesties of a rewrite of the English spelling code, is we would lose all this etymology that tells us these long stories of words and how they came into the lexicon. A couple that jump to mind that never happened. Teddy Roosevelt, when he declared that the government printing office should start using these 300 alternate spellings as devised by the Simplified Spelling Board, and more to come pretty soon. He wanted to do RIME for rhyme, and lept, LEPT, which, back then these things seemed outlandish, but then a certain number of his 300 suggestions we actually started to adopt. He wanted to do although, just ALTHO. And, he was just skewered in the press for this. And yet, I find myself writing although that way now, and maybe that's terrible, or maybe it should just be on my BlackBerry and nowhere else. But how wrong is it? I feel like a broken record saying that kind of thing, but how wrong is it really? I'm not sure I've totally answered your question.
Well, yeah, the other one I was curious about is you mentioned that there's war history in vocabulary, in spelling.
Yes.
And do you have an example of that?
Well, the big one is really with American independence. And Noah Webster's story is so wonderful for a number of reasons, but really he's history's most successful spelling reformer. After the Revolution, Noah and a lot of his cronies believed that independence was great, but what we really needed was cultural independence from the British. The idea being, we need an American language. It's totally distinct. And this was very radical. When he was about 25 years old, he published his first dictionary, very thin, total failure, with all of these really radical spellings like IZ for is. Soup was SOOP, that kind of thing. Then, you fast forward about 30 years, and the Americans are now a little more confident about their position in the world. And Webster's views of language have chilled out quite a bit. That being said, he still thought the U that Brits use in color or valor, he called this a palpable absurdity. And so when he published his great dictionary, he did away with the U, and he did away with the second L in traveler, and a number of other examples. So there are hundreds of words that we use now that we spell differently than the British do because of Webster. So this is one of the sort of war-related examples that I was talking about in the beginning. But there really are themes in here that connect back to that long list of themes I was introducing. I sure hope there are. Well, thank you all for coming. I'll be signing some books and would be happy to talk some more. And just a very quick thank you once more to Noah and Peter here, who helped me tremendously with the book project. I really appreciated that. Thanks again.